The air at 26,000 feet over central Germany was thin, frigid, and unnervingly clear. On the morning of March 24, 1945, a pilot from the 100th Fighter Squadron, 332nd Fighter Group, sat encased in the plexiglass canopy of his P-51D Mustang, a tiny, heated bubble of life suspended in the vast blue emptiness of the stratosphere. Below, a fractured quilt of snow-dusted fields and dark, skeletal forests unspooled toward the horizon, a landscape bled of color. The only sound was the steady, gut-vibrating roar of the Packard V1650 Merlin engine, a 1,600 horsepower heart beating a rhythm of controlled violence. His gloved hands rested lightly on the stick and throttle, his eyes constantly scanning, sweeping the sky in a practiced, life-preserving arc. He and the 70 other Mustangs of the 332nd were shepherds, their flock a sprawling combat box of B-17 flying fortresses from the 5th Bombardment Wing, their silver fuselages glinting like scattered diamonds as they droned inexorably toward Berlin. Then he saw it, not as a plane at first, but as a flaw in the perfect, cold geometry of the sky. A glint, then a streak, moving with a speed that defied the familiar physics of aerial combat. It was a predator of a different order, closing on the lumbering bombers with impossible velocity. The shape resolved itself, a sleek, shark-like fuselage with wings swept back at a gentle angle, no propeller blurring its nose, only two distinct pods slung beneath the wings, trailing faint wisps of dark smoke. It was a Messerschmitt Me-262, the Schwalbe, the Swallow, a jet. It sliced through a formation of bombers, and the sky erupted in flashes of orange light as its 430mm cannons spoke, each shell a high-explosive incendiary round the size of a milk bottle. The jet was there, and then it was gone, climbing away at a rate the Merlin engine could never hope to match. This fleeting, terrifying encounter was more than just another dogfight in the bloody final weeks of the war in Europe. It was a collision point, a moment where the most advanced aerial technology on Earth, the pride of a dying Reich, met the unwavering discipline of men who had been forced to fight a war on two fronts, one against German fascism in the skies over Europe, and another against racial prejudice in the very nation they served. This single mission, culminating in an event so strange it bordered on the unbelievable, would become a definitive statement on how wars are truly won, not by wonder weapons or supremacist ideology, but by the overwhelming, grinding realities of logistics, training, and the unassailable will of those with everything to prove. The strategic situation in early 1945 was one of stark contrasts. The Allied war machine was at the zenith of its industrial power. From bases in England and Italy, thousands of heavy bombers, escorted by swarms of long-range fighters, were systematically pulverizing the industrial heart of Germany. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was a shattered force. It was critically short on fuel, its veteran pilots were nearly all gone, killed, captured or wounded, and its remaining airfields were under constant attack. Yet in its death throes, it had produced a miracle of engineering, the Me-262. With a top speed of over 540 miles per hour, it was a full 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51 Mustang, the best piston-engine fighter the Allies could field. It was a technological leap that threatened to upend the balance of the air war, to give the Reich a defensive weapon so potent it could shatter the American bomber formations and stall the advance into Germany. The jet was a symbol of desperate hope for the Third Reich and a source of profound anxiety for Allied air commanders. Tasked with confronting this threat were groups like the 332nd, stationed at a muddy, windswept airfield in Ramitelli on Italy's Adriatic coast. The 332nd Fighter Group was unique. It was the only all-black fighter group in the United States Army Air Forces. Its pilots, known as the Tuskegee Airmen, were the product of a controversial military experiment rooted in segregation. They had trained in the racially charged environment of Tuskegee, Alabama, under intense scrutiny from a military establishment that largely believed they were incapable of mastering the complex art of aerial combat. They had to overcome inferior training equipment, systemic discrimination, and the immense psychological burden of representing the aspirations of an entire race. But by 1945, They had forged themselves into one of the most effective and disciplined escort units in the 15th Air Force. Their commander, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr., a West Point graduate who had been ostracized by his white classmates for 4 years, instilled in his men a rigid adherence to their primary duty: protect the bombers at all costs. Their P-51 Mustangs were easily identifiable, their tails, spinners, and wingtips painted a brilliant, defiant red, earning them the famous nickname, the Red Tails. For the bomber crews they protected, those red tails became a welcome, life-saving sight in the hostile skies deep inside enemy territory. The mission of March 24th was a supreme test of their capabilities. The target was the Daimler-Benz tank assembly plant at Marienfelde, on the southern outskirts of Berlin. For the pilots of the 332nd, this meant a grueling 1,600-mile round trip, a flight of over 6 hours that would push their P-51s and their own physical endurance to the absolute limit. It was one of the longest fighter escort missions of the war. Before dawn at Ramitelli, the ground crews had been at work for hours, topping off fuel tanks, loading the 6.50 caliber machine guns in the wings with 1,880 rounds of ammunition, and coaxing the Merlin engines to life in the damp, cold air. Each Mustang was fitted with 2 external drop tanks, giving it the necessary range to reach Berlin and fight before turning for the long, perilous journey home. As the sun rose, scores of red-tailed fighters lifted off the pierced steel planking runway, formed up, and began their long climb north, across the Alps and into the heart of the Reich. They rendezvoused with the great armada of B-17s from the 5th Bomb Wing over Czechoslovakia. The bombers were flying in their carefully organized combat boxes, a defensive formation designed to create overlapping fields of fire from hundreds of .50 caliber machine guns. But against a jet attacker, this bristling defense was often tragically inadequate. Me-262 pilot could scream through the formation from the rear, often from a higher altitude, select a target, fire a devastatingly effective burst from his 413 cannons, and be out of range before the bomber's gunners could effectively track him. The slow-firing cannons, designated Mk-108, were crude but brutally effective, earning the nickname pneumatic hammers for their distinctive sound. A mere 3 to 5 hits were typically enough to tear a wing off a B-17 or cause it to explode in midair. The only reliable defense against this revolutionary weapon was its natural predator, the Allied escort fighter. The first turning point in the struggle against the jets had come months earlier, when Allied fighter pilots realized the folly of trying to fight the Me-262 on its own terms. Chasing it in a straight-line sprint was suicide. The P-51 simply could not keep up. Instead, American pilots developed a new set of tactics. They knew the jet was vulnerable in 2 specific phases of flight. Its Jumo 4B turbojet engines were notoriously unreliable, prone to flameouts, and slow to accelerate, making the Me-262 sluggish and exposed during takeoff and landing. Allied fighter sweeps, therefore, began to orbit known jet airfields, pouncing on the German planes when they were at their most helpless. In the air, the key was to use the P-51's superior maneuverability. The Mustang could turn far more tightly than the heavier, faster Me-262. The standard tactic was to dive on the jets from a higher altitude, using gravity to build up speed to close the gap. If the jet pilot made the mistake of engaging in a turning fight, the P-51 could get on his tail and bring its 6 machine guns to bear. This tactical adaptation was a triumph of pilot skill and battlefield pragmatism over a raw technological advantage. On March 24th, as the 332nd escorted the bombers into the heavily defended airspace around Berlin, these tactics were put to the ultimate test. The mission leader for the 100th Fighter Squadron was Captain Roscoe C. Brown, Jr. He spotted a swarm of about a dozen Me-262s from the elite Jagdgeschwader 7 rising to intercept the bomber stream. They were flying in their standard, company front formations of 4, preparing to execute their deadly high-speed passes. Brown, flying at a higher altitude than the bombers, immediately ordered his flight to jettison their drop tanks and led them in a diving attack. The air became a chaotic 3-dimensional melee of contrails, tracer fire, and exploding aircraft. The P-51s, now clean of their external tanks and with throttles pushed to the firewall, screamed down on the German jets. The speed differential was still enormous, giving the American pilots only a fleeting window to get a firing solution, but their training and discipline held. They focused on disrupting the jets' attacks on the bombers, forcing them to break off and defend themselves. This was the core of the red tail philosophy, the doctrine drilled into them by Colonel Davis. Colonel Davis's command philosophy was born from the unique pressures placed upon his group. He knew that any failure, any sign of incompetence, would be used as evidence by segregationists back home to discredit the entire Tuskegee program. He therefore demanded a level of performance and discipline that exceeded the norm. One pilot later recalled the constant emphasis on the mission. "We were told, over and over, that our job was to protect the bombers. Getting an aerial victory was secondary." This ethos led to the group's legendary, almost mythical, claim to have never lost a bomber to an enemy fighter on any of their 200 escort missions. Post-war analysis would reveal this to be a slight exaggeration. Meticulous research by the Air Force identified approximately 27 bombers lost while under their escort, but the number was so dramatically lower than the average for other fighter groups that the legend became a powerful truth in itself. It spoke to a record of success that was undeniable. This fierce dedication to the bombers, this willingness to suppress the individualistic pursuit of aerial kills that defined the classic fighter ace, made the 332nd uniquely suited to their task. They would stick close to the little friends, as they called the bombers, weaving a protective screen around them rather than chasing German fighters for personal glory. This discipline made them the escort of choice for many bomber crews, who specifically requested the Red Tail Angels for the most dangerous missions. Over Berlin, that discipline translated into lethal effectiveness. In the swirling dogfight, Roscoe Brown latched onto the tail of an Me-262. The German pilot, perhaps unnerved by the diving P-51, made a fatal error. He broke into a shallow turn instead of using his superior speed to escape in a straight climb. This was the opening Brown needed. He closed the distance, the German jet growing larger in his gun sight. He squeezed the trigger on his control stick, and all 6.50 caliber machine guns hammered in unison, pouring a stream of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds into the jet's fuselage and right engine. A flicker of orange, then a plume of black smoke, erupted from the Me-262. It faltered, rolled over, and began its final, irreversible plunge toward the ground 20,000 feet below. Elsewhere in the battle, other Red Tail pilots were also finding success. First Lieutenant Earl Lane and Second Lieutenant Charles Brandt teamed up to destroy another jet, while another pilot, Freddie Hutchins, was credited with a third. In a matter of minutes, the 332nd had shot down 3 of the most advanced fighters in the world, a stunning achievement for a single fighter group on a single mission. This success, however, must be viewed against the bleak backdrop of the Luftwaffe's material condition. The Me-262 that Roscoe Brown shot down was a technological marvel, but it was also a deeply flawed and desperate weapon. It was rushed into production by a regime that prioritized radical innovation over logistical sustainability. The Jumo 4 engines that powered it were built with low-grade alloys due to wartime shortages, giving them an operational lifespan of between 10 and 25 hours before they needed a complete overhaul or replacement. A pilot had to handle the throttle with extreme care. Moving it too quickly could cause the engines to flood with fuel and burst into flames. The jet consumed vast quantities of a special synthetic fuel called J2, which was in critically short supply due to the Allied bombing of Germany's oil refineries. Furthermore, there was a desperate shortage of pilots trained to fly the demanding new aircraft. Most of the men flying for Jagdgeschwader 7 were either hastily retrained bomber pilots or young, inexperienced recruits with only a few dozen hours of flight time. They were pitted against American pilots who often had hundreds, if not thousands, of hours in the cockpit. The contest over Berlin was not just between a P-51 and a Me-262. It was between a robust, well-supplied and experienced combat force and the hollowed-out remnant of a once mighty air arm, flying a brilliant but fragile machine. The wonder weapon was a symptom not of strength, but of a terminal industrial illness. After the main engagement had broken up and the surviving German jets had fled, the climax of the day's strange events unfolded. Roscoe Brown, having reformed his flight with First Lieutenant Marcellus G. Smith and Second Lieutenant Charles V. Brandt, was scanning the sky for any remaining threats to the bombers, who were now beginning their turn for home after successfully dropping their payloads on the Daimler-Benz plant. Suddenly, they spotted a lone Me-262 flying slowly and erratically several thousand feet below them. It was not making any aggressive moves. The three P-51s dove to investigate, their guns charged and ready. As they closed in, bracketing the jet on both sides and from behind, the German pilot did something unprecedented. He rocked his wings back and forth. It was the universal, unambiguous signal of surrender. Brown and his wingmen stared in disbelief. Here was a German pilot, flying the fastest, most advanced fighter plane in the world, giving up without a fight. The German pilot, widely believed to have been Lieutenant Hans-Joachim Lange of JG-7, was clearly in distress. He may have been out of fuel, or perhaps his notoriously unreliable engines were on the verge of failing, or just as likely his morale had simply shattered. He was alone, deep in a sky controlled by the enemy, his comrades shot down around him, a participant in a war that was catastrophically and visibly lost. He lowered his landing gear, a further gesture of submission. The three red-tailed Mustangs closed in, flying a tight escort formation around the crippled jet. In a bizarre reversal of roles, they were now escorting an enemy fighter. The German pilot gestured toward the ground, pointing to a nearby Luftwaffe airfield. He was indicating where he was going to land and surrender his aircraft. The American pilots understood, but they could not follow him down. To descend to low altitude over a heavily defended enemy airfield would be suicide. They had accepted his surrender in the air, but they could not take him prisoner. They watched as the Me-262 peeled away, descending toward the runway. Its ultimate fate, and that of its pilot, was never officially confirmed by the Americans. Having completed their duty, and with their own fuel gauges dipping dangerously low, Brown, Smith, and Brandt banked their Mustangs away and began the long, quiet flight back to Italy. The mission of March 24, 1945, was an unmitigated triumph for the 332nd Fighter Group. They had escorted the 5th Bomb Wing to Berlin and back, over 1,600 miles, without a single bomber under their direct protection being lost to enemy fighters. They had engaged the Luftwaffe's most feared weapon and decisively defeated it, destroying 3 Me-262s in the air and compelling a 4th to surrender. For his actions that day, Roscoe Brown would be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The mission became a capstone achievement for the Tuskegee Airmen, a definitive and public rebuttal to anyone who had ever doubted their skill, courage, or patriotism. In the larger context of the war, the event was a small but significant indicator of the Reich's total collapse. On that very same day, hundreds of miles to the west, Allied forces were conducting Operation Varsity, a massive airborne assault to cross the Rhine River, the last major geographic barrier to the heart of Germany. The war in Europe had less than 2 months left to run. The surrender of a jet pilot was a clear sign that, for the men of the Luftwaffe, the will to fight was evaporating as quickly as their fuel supplies. The strange surrender in the sky over Berlin was more than a mere historical footnote. It was a moment of profound symbolic resonance. It represented the ultimate failure of the Nazi ideology of racial supremacy. A pilot of the so-called master race, flying a machine intended as the ultimate expression of Aryan technological genius, was forced to capitulate to men whom his own state propaganda would have dismissed as subhuman. Those men, the pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group, represented a different kind of power. They were the product of a democracy, however flawed and imperfect, that could still harness the talent of all its citizens. Their P-51 Mustang was not a rare, handcrafted wonder weapon, but the result of the immense industrial capacity of the United States, a nation that could produce over 15,000 such aircraft. The victory of the Red Tails was a victory of material reality over myth. It proved that superior training, unbreakable discipline, overwhelming numbers, and a robust supply chain would always defeat a technologically advanced but logistically crippled opponent. The fuel in the tanks of the P-51s, the thousands of hours of training each pilot received, the sheer number of fighters that could be put into the sky. These were the factors that won the air war. The Tuskegee Airmen had proven themselves in the most demanding crucible imaginable, and in doing so had helped win not just a war against a foreign enemy, but a crucial battle in their own country's long struggle for equality. The sleek, futuristic jet, a symbol of a twisted and bankrupt ideology, had been mastered by the humble, reliable, red-tailed Mustang, a symbol of a promise yet to be fully kept.